Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating periods in the history of Westeros, a time that historians, meisters, and common folk alike remember with reverence and longing. We're talking about the era known as the Golden Age of Westeros, a period that sets the stage for everything we see unfold in House of the Dragon. But what exactly made this time so special? Why do people look back on it with such nostalgia? And most importantly, what led to its eventual collapse? Stick around, because we're about to explore all of that and more. Before we get into the meat of this topic, let's establish some context. The Golden Age of Westeros primarily refers to the reign of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, also known as the Old King or the Conciliator, and it extends into the early years of his successor, King Viserys I Targaryen. We're talking about a period that spans roughly 70 to 80 years of relative peace and prosperity, beginning around 48 AC, that's after the conquest, and lasting until the death of Viserys in 129 AC. This is absolutely crucial to understand because when House of the Dragon begins, we're witnessing the tail end of this golden era, and the series shows us how quickly paradise can turn into purgatory. So let's start at the beginning with the man who made it all possible. King Jaehaerys Targaryen ascended to the Iron Throne in 48 AC, and he didn't exactly inherit a stable kingdom. His uncle, Maegor the Cruel, had just finished terrorizing the realm with his brutal reign of blood and fire. Maegor's rule was so tyrannical that by the time he died, mysteriously found dead on the Iron Throne itself, the Targaryen dynasty was in shambles. The Faith Militant was in open rebellion, the great houses were wary and resentful, and the common people were terrified of their Dragon Lord rulers. This was not a good look for a dynasty that had only been in power for about 50 years at that point. When young Jaehaerys took the throne at just 14 years old, nobody really expected much from him. After all, his father Aenys had been weak and ineffectual, and his uncle Maegor had been a monster. The smart money would have been on the Targaryen dynasty collapsing within a generation or two. But Jaehaerys proved to be something entirely different from his predecessors. He combined his grandfather Aegon the Conqueror's vision with a temperament that was uniquely suited to peacetime governance. And this is where the Golden Age really begins. Now, when we talk about why this period earned the name Golden Age, we need to understand that Jaehaerys didn't achieve this through conquest or intimidation. Instead, he did something revolutionary for a Westerosi king. He actually focused on making his subjects' lives better. I know, shocking concept, right? But seriously, this was a big deal. One of the first things Jaehaerys did was end the Faith Militant Uprising, not through more bloodshed, but through negotiation and compromise. He offered the faith generous terms of amnesty, agreeing to become the defender of the faith and respecting the Seven's authority in spiritual matters, but only if they disbanded their military orders and acknowledged Targaryen rule. This was brilliant diplomacy because it ended a devastating civil war without creating martyrs or driving the conflict underground. Think about what this accomplished. With one stroke, Jaehaerys ended an 11-year rebellion, secured the religious legitimacy of his house despite the Targaryen practice of incestuous marriage, and showed the realm that he was a king who preferred wisdom to warfare. The small folk and the nobility alike could breathe easier knowing that their king wasn't going to solve every problem by burning it to ash with dragonfire. And this set the tone for everything that followed. Let's talk about infrastructure, because this is where Jaehaerys really showed his genius. In 62 AC, the king looked around his kingdom and realized something pretty fundamental. There were no proper roads connecting the seven kingdoms. Sure, there were old tracks and trails, some dating back thousands of years, but nothing unified or well maintained. So what did Jaehaerys do? He ordered the construction of a massive network of roads throughout the realm, the most important of which became known as the Kingsroad. This highway ran all the way from Storm's End in the south to the Wall in the far north, connecting the entire kingdom in a way it had never been connected before. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's nice, but why does a road matter so much? Well, think about what roads actually do for a kingdom. They facilitate trade, which means merchants can move goods more safely and quickly, which means more economic prosperity for everyone. They allow for faster communication, which means the king's justice can be administered more effectively throughout the realm. They enable the rapid movement of armies, which means rebellious lords think twice before causing trouble. And perhaps most importantly, they psychologically unite the kingdom by making it easier for people from different regions to interact and identify as part of something larger than their local area. But Jaehaerys didn't stop with roads. He also improved King's Landing itself with major public works projects. We're talking about proper drainage systems, sewers, and wells. His Hand of the King, Septon Barth, understood something that was pretty advanced for the time, that fresh water and proper sanitation were crucial for public health. This dramatically improved conditions in the capital city and reduced the frequency and severity of disease outbreaks. Again, these might seem like small things, but they had enormous impact on people's daily lives. When your children aren't dying from contaminated water or preventable diseases, you tend to have a much more positive view of your government. Speaking of Septon Barth, we need to talk about another key factor in the Golden Age, which is the quality of people Jaehaerys surrounded himself with. A good king knows that he can't do everything alone, and Jaehaerys had an absolute gift for identifying talented individuals and putting them in positions where they could excel. Septon Barth served as Hand of the King for decades and became legendary for his competence and wisdom. The fact that a low-born man could rise to become the second most powerful person in the kingdom sent a powerful message about merit over birth, which inspired countless ambitious young people throughout the realm. Then there was good Queen Alysanne, Jaehaerys' sister and wife. Yes, the Targaryens practice incestuous marriage to keep their bloodline pure, but in this case, it actually worked out pretty well. Alysanne was not just beautiful, she was intelligent, compassionate, and politically savvy. Many said that she ruled the realm as much as the king did, and there was definitely truth to that. It was Alysanne who convinced Jaehaerys to abolish the practice of first night, that horrific custom where a lord could claim the right to bed any bride from his lands on her wedding night. This was hugely unpopular among the nobility, who saw it as their ancient right, but it made Alysanne beloved among the small folk, who were the ones actually suffering under this barbaric tradition. The queen also made numerous royal progresses throughout the realm, personally visiting remote areas that had never seen royalty before. She championed causes for women and children, established institutions to help the poor, and generally used her position to make life better for the most vulnerable members of society. This created enormous goodwill for the crown and demonstrated that the Targaryens could be more than just distant dragon riders lording over everyone from above. Now, let's discuss what might be Jaehaerys' most lasting achievement: the creation of a unified legal code for the Seven Kingdoms. Before Jaehaerys, each region had its own laws and customs, some of which were wildly different from each other. What was legal in Dorne might be a hanging offense in the north, and vice versa. Even Aegon the Conqueror had left local laws alone, figuring it was better not to antagonize his new subjects by messing with their traditions. But Jaehaerys recognized that this patchwork system created injustice and confusion. So he did something unprecedented. He created the first unified code of law that applied from the north to the Dornish marches. This was absolutely revolutionary. It meant that for the first time in history, a merchant in White Harbor could make a contract knowing it would be interpreted the same way in Old Town. A criminal in the Riverlands couldn't escape justice by fleeing to the Reach and claiming different laws applied. Everyone, from the highest lord to the lowest peasant, was theoretically subject to the same rules. Now, of course, in practice, the nobility still had advantages that common folk didn't have, but the principle was established that law applied equally across the realm. This created a sense of unity and fairness that had never existed before under the rule of the Iron Throne. And we can't ignore the dragons. The Golden Age also coincided with the period when House Targaryen possessed more dragons than at any other point in its history. During the reigns of Jaehaerys and Viserys, there were nearly 20 dragons alive and bonded to riders. Think about what this meant for the Targaryen dynasty. These dragons represented overwhelming military might that no combination of earthly forces could hope to challenge. But more than that, they represented the magic and majesty of old Valyria. When common folk saw dragons soaring overhead, they were reminded that their rulers were special, touched by powers beyond normal understanding. The presence of so many dragons also kept the great houses in line without Jaehaerys having to actually use them very often. It's a lot like nuclear deterrence in the modern world. You don't have to use your weapons if everyone knows you have them and could deploy them at any moment. Lords who might have considered rebellion or treachery thought twice when they remembered that their king could call upon a dozen dragons if necessary. This underlying threat of overwhelming force, combined with Jaehaerys' generally just and benevolent rule, kept the realm peaceful. But it wasn't just about intimidation. The dragons were also symbols of the Targaryen right to rule. The ability to bond with and ride dragons was something only those with Valyrian blood could do, and it set the Targaryens apart as something more than mere mortals. In an age before democracy or constitutional limits on royal power, people believed in the divine right of kings. The dragons proved that the Targaryens were chosen by fate or the gods to rule Westeros. This gave their dynasty a legitimacy that went beyond simple military conquest. The economic prosperity of this period was also remarkable. With peace reigning throughout the realm, trade flourished. Merchants could move goods without fear of being caught in some lord's petty war. Farmers could plant crops knowing they'd live to harvest them. Artisans and craftsmen could focus on perfecting their trades instead of being dragged off to fight in someone's army. The royal treasury was full, which allowed for those infrastructure projects we talked about earlier, and it also meant the crown could respond effectively when disasters did strike, like harsh winters or disease outbreaks. This prosperity wasn't just limited to the wealthy either. The small folk, who make up the vast majority of Westeros' population, saw real improvements in their lives. Better roads meant better trade, which meant more economic opportunities even in remote villages. Legal reforms meant they had some protection against the absolute worst abuses by their lords. The abolition of First Night meant their daughters were safer. Public health improvements in cities meant lower mortality rates. These might not sound like much compared to modern standards, but for medieval society, they represented genuine progress. Now, we need to talk about the cultural and intellectual flourishing that happened during this period. Peace and prosperity create conditions where art, literature, and learning can thrive. During the Golden Age, the Citadel in Old Town continued its work of preserving and expanding human knowledge. Septon Barth wrote his famous text, Unnatural History, which contained observations about dragons and other creatures that were considered radical at the time. The royal court became a center of music, poetry, and refined culture. Knights and lords could focus on perfecting their martial skills in tournaments rather than actual warfare, leading to what many consider the golden age of knighthood as well. This cultural flowering is important because it created a shared identity across the Seven Kingdoms. When bards could travel safely throughout the realm, sharing songs and stories, they spread ideas and cultural touchstones that helped people from Dorne to the north feel like they were part of the same civilization. When Meisters could correspond and share knowledge without their ravens being shot down by warring armies, human understanding advanced. When knights could compete in tournaments and win glory without having to actually kill people, it elevated the ideals of chivalry and honor. All of this contributed to the sense that Westeros was entering an era of enlightenment and refinement. But here's the thing about golden ages. They're always more complex than they first appear, and they never last forever. Even during Jaehaerys' long reign, there were shadows and problems brewing beneath the surface of prosperity. The king and queen had 13 children together, but their family life was marked by tragedy. Many of their children died young, and those who survived into adulthood often experienced difficult relationships with their parents or met untimely ends themselves. The question of succession became increasingly complicated as Jaehaerys outlived not just one, but two of his chosen heirs. First, his eldest son Aemon, who everyone expected would make an excellent king, was killed by a Myrish crossbow bolt in Tarth. Then his second son Balon, whom Jaehaerys named as his new heir, died of a burst belly. This left Jaehaerys in a terrible position. Should the throne pass to Aemon's daughter Rhaenys, who had the better claim by proximity to the original heir? Or should it go to Balon's son Viserys, who had the advantage of being male? This wasn't just an academic question. Whoever Jaehaerys chose would set a precedent for Targaryen succession that would bind his descendants for generations. In 101 AC, Jaehaerys called a great council at Harrenhal, bringing together all the great lords of Westeros to decide the succession. This was actually a brilliant move because it took the decision out of the king's hands alone and made it a collective choice of the realm's nobility. The lords voted overwhelmingly in favor of Viserys, primarily because he was male and they didn't want a woman on the Iron Throne. Princess Rhaenys, despite having what many considered the better claim, was passed over specifically because of her gender. She became known as the Queen Who Never Was, and this decision would have profound consequences down the line. When Jaehaerys finally died in 103 AC at the age of 69, he had reigned for 55 years. The realm genuinely mourned his passing, and it's said that even in Dorne, traditionally hostile to Targaryen rule, people wept at the news. His ashes were interred with those of good Queen Alysanne, who had predeceased him, beneath the Red Keep, and the chronicles of the time stated plainly that the realm never saw their like again. This is important phrasing because it acknowledges that something special and irreplaceable had been lost. Viserys I, Targaryen, inherited this golden age from his grandfather, and to his credit, he did maintain it, at least on the surface, for the first years of his reign. The realm continued to prosper, the treasury remained full, and there were more dragons than ever before. Tourists visiting King's Landing during Viserys' early reign would have seen a magnificent city, a powerful dynasty at the height of its power, and a kingdom at peace. They would have had no reason to suspect that within a few decades, this same kingdom would tear itself apart in the most destructive civil war in Westerosi history. So what went wrong? How did the Golden Age end? Well, that's exactly what House of the Dragon is about. The seeds of destruction were actually planted during that great council in 101 AC. By establishing the precedent that male heirs come before female ones, regardless of the strength of their claims, Jaehaerys and the Great Council created a succession law that seemed clear at the time, but would prove disastrous. When Viserys decided to name his daughter Rhaenyra as his heir instead of his brother Daemon, he was going directly against the precedent that had been set for his own ascension. This wasn't just hypocrisy on Viserys' part, though there was certainly an element of that. Daemon was genuinely a problematic choice, temperamental, violent, and hungry for power in ways that made many people nervous. Rhaenyra, by contrast, seemed like she would make a competent queen, and Viserys loved her dearly. But by making this choice, Viserys was essentially asking the realm to ignore its own recently established rules. And when you're a king in a feudal society where legitimacy and precedent are everything, that's an incredibly dangerous thing to do. The situation became even more complicated when Viserys remarried after his first wife's death and had sons with his new queen, Alysanne Hightower. Now there were two competing claims to the throne: Rhaenyra, the king's chosen heir and eldest child, versus Aegon, the king's eldest son and a male heir who fit the precedent established at the Great Council. Different factions at court supported different claimants, and as Viserys' health declined, these factions grew more entrenched and more hostile toward each other. What makes this situation so tragic is that it was entirely preventable. If Viserys had been a stronger king, if he'd been willing to decisively deal with the factionalism at court instead of hoping everyone would just get along, if he'd prepared the realm properly for Rhaenyra's succession instead of just assuming his word would be enough, the Dance of the Dragons might never have happened. But Viserys, for all his good qualities, was not a decisive leader. He wanted peace and harmony so badly that he was willing to ignore obvious problems, hoping they'd resolve themselves. They did not. When Viserys died in 129 AC, the Golden Age died with him. What followed was the Dance of the Dragons, a brutal civil war between the Blacks, who supported Rhaenyra's claim, and the Greens, who supported her half-brother Aegon. This conflict would see dragons fighting dragons for the first time, tearing the realm apart and destroying much of what Jaehaerys and Viserys had built. By the time the war ended, most of the Targaryen dragons were dead, tens of thousands of people had perished, and the kingdom was devastated. The Golden Age had given way to an age of blood and fire. So when we look back and ask why this period is called the Golden Age of Westeros, we have to consider multiple factors. First, it was a time of unprecedented peace lasting multiple generations, something incredibly rare in Westerosi history. Second, it saw genuine improvement in the lives of common people through infrastructure projects, legal reforms, and the abolition of cruel customs. Third, it featured wise and capable leadership in the form of Jaehaerys and Alysanne, who genuinely cared about good governance. Fourth, it witnessed a cultural and intellectual flowering that elevated Westerosi civilization. And fifth, it represented the absolute peak of Targaryen power, with more dragons than ever before and unquestioned dominance over the Seven Kingdoms. But we also have to acknowledge the darker aspects. The Golden Age was built on the implied threat of overwhelming draconic force. It benefited the nobility far more than the small folk, even if the latter did see some improvements. And most importantly, it contained the seeds of its own destruction in the form of unresolved succession issues and building tensions that would eventually explode into civil war. The Golden Age teaches us several important lessons about power, governance, and human nature. It shows us that wise leadership really can make a tremendous difference in people's lives. Jaehaerys' focus on infrastructure, law, and public welfare created genuine prosperity and progress. But it also shows us that even the best rulers can't solve every problem, and that some issues, like the sexist succession laws that prioritize male heirs regardless of merit, can have consequences that echo down through generations. It reminds us that peace is precious but fragile, requiring constant maintenance and wise choices to preserve. Viserys' failure to address the succession crisis didn't cause problems during his own reign, but it guaranteed that his death would trigger catastrophe, and it demonstrates that golden ages, by their very nature, can't last forever. The conditions that create them are always temporary, and human nature being what it is, conflict and tragedy eventually return. For the characters living through the events of House of the Dragon, the Golden Age is a recent memory, something their parents and grandparents experienced directly. They know what they've lost, which makes the tragedy of the Dance of the Dragons even more poignant. These people had paradise, or at least the closest thing to it that feudal society could offer, and they destroyed it through pride, ambition, and an inability to compromise. That's the real tragedy here. The Dance of the Dragons wasn't some inevitable fate. It was a choice, or rather a series of choices, made by people who should have known better. So as we watch House of the Dragon and see the realm descend into chaos and bloodshed, we should remember what came before. The Golden Age of Westeros under Jaehaerys I and the early reign of Viserys I represents not just a historical period, but a lost possibility, a road not taken. It shows us what the Seven Kingdoms could be at their best, when wise leaders prioritize the common good over personal ambition, when dragons are used as deterrents rather than weapons of war, and when peace is valued more than glory. And it makes the fall that follows all the more heartbreaking, because we know that none of it had to happen. That's why this period is called the Golden Age of Westeros. It was a time when the kingdom actually lived up to its potential, when the dream of the Seven Kingdoms being truly united under just and benevolent rule came closest to reality. It wasn't perfect. No human society ever is. But it was extraordinary by the standards of its time and place, and the people who lived through it knew they were experiencing something special. When Jaehaerys died, they buried more than a king. They buried an era, and as House of the Dragon shows us, they would spend the next decades learning just how precious that era had been and just how much it cost to throw it away. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Westerosi history, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the rich world that George R.R. Martin created. Drop a comment below and let me know what aspect of the Golden Age you find most fascinating, or what you think would have happened if Viserys had made different choices about the succession. Until next time, may your reign be long and your dragons many.